Hello everybody and welcome back to the Eureka Centre here in UCC. And in this session, as you can see from the screen, we're going to look at the linking of learning outcomes to teaching and learning activities and to assessment. Very important area. Now, Stephen Adams, who is a real expert on the Bologna process and writes very well about it, talks about the fact that learning outcomes approach, our learning outcomes framework, our teaching within the learning outcomes framework doesn't simply involve writing the learning outcomes and then forgetting about everything else. We have to link together these three areas: learning outcomes, teaching and learning activities, and assessment. And I want to cover with you now how to do this. Now, when we're assessing learning outcomes, there's really two key questions we have to ask ourselves. Number one, how will I know if my students have achieved the learning outcomes that I want them to achieve? And number two, how will I measure the extent to which the students have achieved the learning outcomes? Now, matching it is quite straightforward, matching the learning outcome to a method of assessment. For example, if one of your learning outcomes is demonstrate good presentation skills, then obviously the only way to assess that learning outcome is to see the student making a presentation, maybe to their peers or something like that. So the action verb in the learning outcome is often a good clue as to how it should be assessed. Now, Paul Ramsden wrote a most marvellous book. I'll refer you to it in a moment. And he says that, there are certain misconceptions about assessment. And he said one of the misconceptions is that assessment is not involved in helping students to diagnose their errors and misconceptions or reinforce their correct understanding. Assessment must be used as a tool, not just to assess the students in providing a mark, but also to help the students to get a better understanding of what we're trying to teach them. So that book there, Learning to Teach in Higher Education, well worth getting a copy of it. And likewise, John Biggs and Catherine Tang's book, Teaching for Quality Learning at University, well worth your while having both of those books on your bookshelf in your office. Now, I'm just going to very briefly run through one or two slides here. Formative assessment, commonly called assessment for learning. It's where you integrate assessment into the teaching and learning feedback. And Paul Black and Shirley Williams did quite a bit of work way back in the 1990s, and they showed that formative assessment is a very powerful tool to help students get a better understanding of the topic. Summative assessment is assessment of learning. It's assessment which just generates a mark. Usually involves just a traditional written type of examination and has its limits. One of the limits is, of course, that on a 2 or 3 hour exam paper, you can only assess a small number of the learning outcomes. Whereas in continuous assessment, that's a combination of the two, and it can involve repeated summative assessments. Usually marks are just recorded, little feedback given to the students, so little opportunity for them to improve their knowledge and understanding. This slide I got from my good friend and colleague, Dr. Marion McCarthy, former Vice President of Teaching and Learning here in UCC, in which he gave a lecture on assessment. And I was very impressed by this slide because it's talk about growth, that assessment should be helping our students to grow rather than just a sort of a stick to beat them with. And she emphasised the importance of providing continuous feedback, helping students to document their learning and using rubrics. Now, I will be talking about the role of rubrics in assessment in another one of these talks down the road. Rubrics are, of course, very important. You need to worry about them for the moment. Now, sometimes there's a lack of understanding between the words assessment and evaluation. So, whereas they use the same tools for assessing and evaluating students, educators have a different perspective of what is assessment and what is evaluation. So it's quite well explained here, where they talk about we can use the results of a midterm exam for both assessment and evaluation. If we use the results to review the students' course materials, point out common mistakes and improve the student learning, then we're talking about good quality assessment. On the other hand, if we're just deciding to assign a mark with no feedback to the student, then it's evaluation. So evaluation is just putting a mark on it, what it's worth, whereas assessment is giving feedback and using it in a formative fashion to help the students. And at the moment, the traditional ways of assessing, very much examination focused. Sometimes the criteria for assessment are very vague. We're now moving more towards coursework and making the criteria very clear so that the students can achieve the learning outcomes. Student-centered assessment, linking the assessment to learning outcomes, looking at assessment as performance of understanding are all key topics now in the education literature. And making sure that the assessment is valid, that it's reliable, that it's an authentic form of assessment. So there are some indicators of effective assessment in higher education, and the key indicator is that we make it part of our teaching and learning, that we link assessment to teaching and learning, and also that we have policies within our department. And there's a lot of great work going on in this area with our CERTL group here in UCC. Now, if you remember from our definition of learning outcomes, statements of what a student will know, understand and be able to do. This word do is key. So when we've written our learning outcomes, we must ask ourselves is, what must students be able to do in order to show us that they've achieved the learning outcomes? Well, that brings us to consider, is there a balance between formative and summative? Or is all our assessment purely on summative? So that's something that we have to think of ourselves. The various modes of assessment I've summarised there in that slide. I know in education, portfolio assessment, I'll talk about that in a moment, but this is a very important area in the area of school placement. And the great advantage of using several modes of assessment rather than just sticking to the old written examinations is that it allows us to look at our students from different perspectives and allow them to perform to the best of their ability in achieving the learning outcomes. Now, I mentioned there about portfolio assessment, and this was taken there a few years ago before we changed to electronic portfolios. But I want to show you this photograph because it shows the importance of portfolio assessment, that while our student teachers are out in schools teaching, they are keeping track of all of the work that they do in the form of a portfolio, lesson plans and resources and so on. And they bring these in. Our students are generally out in schools in the morning and they're in here with us in the afternoon. So we can monitor how this portfolio is put together and the tremendous amount of work that goes into it. So portfolio is a great form, a great tool for assessing the amount of work that the students have done on their school placement with their own pupils. And of course, again, this is another slide I got from my good friend and colleague, Dr. Marion McCarthy. And again, she speaks highly in terms of multiple intelligences, that if we have a variety of assessment techniques, we can match the assessment techniques to be fair to the students, rather than just having one method of assessment. So that's one of the big challenges for all of us, to move away from just terminal exams to a more holistic approach to assessment. And you know, the old cartoon, which you'll find on the internet, everybody has to take the same exam, please climb that tree. You know, or the other one, class all year long, I've taught each of you to learn at your own pace, in your own personal style. I've set goals for each of you individually to help you reach your own unique potential, and now the results of that will be measured with a standardized test. You know, so that's the sort of thing we have to avoid falling into. Now, coming back to the question I posed at the beginning of this talk, how do we link the learning outcomes to the assessment? Well, as you may recall earlier on, I said if one of your learning outcomes is to demonstrate good presentation skills, then the only way is to ask them to make a presentation to their peers. And this is a very powerful way, I find, in my own teaching, when you give them projects, that the students have to explain the project, their results, their findings, their methodology, and so on, to their peers. Look at this second one, formulate a food product, maybe a new type of yogurt, new type of cheese. The only way you can do that, of course, is to go into your food science laboratory and try out various experiments. Identify an area for research. Good way to assess that learning outcome, prepare a research proposal. Or to identify the signs and symptoms of multiple sclerosis in a patient. Very often in medicine, they use multiple choice questions to test the understanding and knowledge of their students. So, generally speaking, therefore, if you have a number of learning outcomes in your module, I would suggest that you do a bit of a check to see, do you have a wide range of assessments? You know, that you're not just assessing a written paper. I know they're very good in the science area, for example, of awarding marks for laboratory practical work. You know, so they have a written exam, they might have laboratory practical work, then they might give students various projects during the year, and so on. So they have a wide variety of assessment. So the question is, to what extent has each learning outcome been achieved? You see, learning outcomes aren't like electronic switches. It's not a case of either the light being on or the light is off. There's a current flowing or it's not flowing. That's not how learning outcomes work, because different students can achieve different learning outcomes to different extents. So you need some sort of a grading tool to try to figure out the extent to which the student has achieved the learning outcome. And that's called a rubric, and I'll be talking about that in the next presentation. I've kept it as a separate presentation rather than go off at a tangent now. But that certainly helps us to monitor the extent, to assess the extent to which students have achieved a particular learning outcome. And so we need to look at this area of alignment between the teaching and learning methods we use, the learning outcomes, and the assessment. And, you know, learning outcomes do not involve any change at all in our teaching. The good teacher always has been teaching, well before Bologna, has been teaching very high standards. All that Bologna is doing really is helping us, with the aid of learning outcomes, to focus more clearly on our learning outcomes and on our teaching and learning and on our assessment. So Some people, when Bologna came out, they wrote papers saying, oh, this is a real paradigm shift. I don't believe in that at all. Good teachers have always been brilliant, whether we have Bologna process or not. You still will do a fantastic job. All that Bologna has done is help us to try to crystallize and get a clearer view of what is happening. And so you have this dynamic equilibrium between teaching for understanding on one hand, and then the learning outcomes and the assessment feeding back in this dynamic equilibrium to help us to become better teachers. Now, John Biggs put it very well indeed. John Biggs said, if we look at the teacher's point of view, we write the objectives of the module, we write the learning outcomes, then we engage in teaching activities, and then we assess to see if the learning outcomes have been achieved. But, says John Biggs, that's not how the students look at it. The students start with the assessment. Tell us what we must do to pass the exam, and we'll do it. Is that what they say? All over the world. So the students start with the assessment, and then they engage with learning activities in order to achieve the learning outcomes. So John Biggs gives very good advice. He says, to the teacher, assessment is at the end of the teaching learning sequence, but to the student, it's at the beginning. Now he says, if the curriculum is reflected in the assessment as indicated by the downward arrow, then the teaching activities of the teacher and the learner activities of the learner are both directed towards the same goal. In other words, by making the learning outcomes clear to the students and getting the students to engage in activities which will lead to them to achieve the learning outcomes, we will achieve this dynamic equilibrium as we spoke about. Now, John Biggs coined the phrase constructive alignment in the world of education. I won't go into the details of it because it'll lengthen very much the presentation, and I've been warned to keep the presentations short. But the word constructive and alignment make very good sense. But Morse and Murray, in talking about constructive alignment, they spoke it very well. They said they spoke about it very well. They said constructive alignment is just a fancy name for joining up the dots. Now, what dots are they talking about? They're talking about the various ingredients. They said, here we are, we define the learning outcomes. Then we have teaching and learning methods to achieve the learning outcomes. Then we choose a technique to assess the extent to which the students have achieved the learning outcomes. Then we assess the learning outcomes and check to see how well they match with what was intended. And the joining of the dots, as it were, there are a number of ways of representing it, but one way I like to represent it is by means of the 3-column table. Here are our learning outcomes, here are the teaching and learning activities, and here is a whole series of assessments. Now, I won't spend much time on that slide because you can look at it in your own time, but you can see there where we have a fairly comprehensive list of teaching and learning activities, we have a fairly comprehensive list of assessment. And if you want to ensure that you have constructive alignment, here's an example. For example, here you have the cognitive, the affective, and the psychomotor domains with learning outcomes in each of the 3 types. Here you have teaching and learning activities linked to the learning outcomes. And here you have the assessment linked to the teaching and learning activities and to the learning outcomes to make sure that we assess the 3. So the learning outcomes, the teaching and learning activities, and the assessment are all aligned according to John Biggs. And this is one way I checked for constructive alignment in one of the modules that I teach in my BSc Science Education degree course. And a nice way, I think, of representing this on paper is by the three corners of the triangle there, where you have the learning outcomes, the teaching and learning activities, and the assessment, all interlinked with these double-headed arrows. And if any one of the corners of the triangle are missing, the whole thing collapses. And that's where constructive alignment comes in. The joining of the dots, as it were, between the three important areas there. Another way of representing it is by means of the three overlapping circles here in our Venn diagram, where you have the learning outcomes, the teaching and learning activities, and the assessment method. And if all those are aligned properly, then we can say for certain that the learning outcomes have been achieved. So you might remember in my previous talk, I spoke about this area of constructive alignment. And now we can see where we're going towards. So after identifying the program learning outcomes, designing the modules, assigning the credits, design teaching and learning, we need to check that this constructive alignment exists. And the 3-column table is a very effective way. And if it doesn't, we just go back and make changes. Either in the program learning outcomes or in the number of modules or the number of ECTS credits, or usually what we have to change are the module learning outcomes. And remember, don't expect that you'll get this right the first time. The first time that you write learning outcomes for a module, you teach the module, and you might go back and say, I better change those learning outcomes, in the light of your experience. And that is quite common. So that's what teaching is all about, that we're assessing what we're doing and striving for improvement in our teaching, learning and assessment. Now, sometimes I'm asked that question here, does every learning outcome that you've written in your module, does it have to be assessed? Well, of course, in theory, we should be assessing every learning outcome, but of course, in practice, this isn't possible. Now, there are some cases where every learning outcome has to be assessed, like in the license of practice in medicine, or like in an aircraft pilot, that you might achieve the learning outcome for taking off the plane, but you don't know how to land it. Okay, so clearly that wouldn't be a very good idea. Right, so one of the problems, of course, about an examination paper is that you are limited in the assessment. If your entire module is just assessed by means of a written exam paper, then you're only dealing with sampling of learning outcomes, and then due to a choice, the number of learning outcomes that you assess may be even less than what you had intended. Right. So to summarize what I'm saying, assessment plays an important role in helping the students to learn rather than evaluation, which just assigns a mark. Formative, summative, or continuous forms of assessment exist, and if we use several different modes of assessment, we get a better opportunity to find out what our students really understand. And when teaching within a learning outcomes framework, it's essential to ensure that we have constructive alignment, and that can easily be tested for and shown by means of the 3-column table. So I hope you're not too exhausted after that whistle-stop tour. Thank you for staying till the last slide. God bless you all, and we'll wrap up now.